Route 5. I had a feeling my father would rather see me playing with toys than training, but that he also preferred to see me training than doing anything dangerous, so he tried to strike an odd kind of middle ground. He gathered blocks with words written on them and placed them inside the boxes, arranging them to write out messages for me. Basic stuff like Dada and I love you, like we were playing together. Since I knew this must have been strange for him, and that I probably wasn't a very cute child, I didn't mind playing along with him as best I could either. But all told, I like to think that the first round of box training went rather well. When I guided my chakra to flow through it, it bubbled up around the box visibly, in an uneven lumpy golden mass. At the same time, it flowed through and within the box too, brushing against its contents and giving an odd kind of sensory feedback, as touching upon other things changed its flow. If I had to guess, this step of the training was meant to familiarize people with the idea of perceiving things with their chakra at all, with the absorbent metal heightening people's awareness of it to make it easier for students to get used to viewing the world through a different sense than what they were used to. I had about 3 years and a truly absurd numbers of man-hours making sense of the bigger picture through a lot of disjointed and vague details though. So once my chakra was flowing through the box, making out what was on some blocks was pretty simple. Chakra was still a new sense to me, similar to but not quite like any of the others, but I managed. Mama, I said, reading the words on the block as I stopped the flow of chakra. My father nodded, clapping softly, and with 3 consecutive successes, he replaced the conductive box in front of me with a neutral one. And that's where I ran into an issue. As my father and grandfather had mentioned, without the box doing it for me, I had to surround the neutral box with chakra myself. Easier said than done. Without the absorbent properties of the first box, it was much harder to channel chakra through the material, because a lot of the chakra I put into it just leaked right back out. It wasn't as simple as just pushing twice as much chakra through it either, because it wasn't just a mathematical issue, but a structural one. If you built a building and someone cut away half of it, it may or may not still stand. But if you cut away every other foot or inch of it, of course it would collapse. I could make a suction cup on the surface with my chakra, like I could when climbing walls. But whenever I tried to flow chakra through it, bits and pieces would go awry, and the whole circuit would break. I assumed the idea behind surrounding it with chakra was to give me time to figure out how to address that problem, but it wasn't as simple as just surrounding the box either. Because I could release a cloud of chakra around the box easily enough, but then the chakra would just spread out and dissipate into the air without doing anything. Instead, it was easy to see that the way I was supposed to complete this exercise was, as they told me, to combine the lessons of concentration, tree climbing, and water walking. By gathering chakra at a point, maintaining it, and then steadily increasing it, the chakra around one of my hands began to bulge and swell, invisible to my eyes, but not to my Kikaichu. It started close to my skin, but steadily inflated like a balloon, growing until it was larger than my head, and then, like a balloon, it popped. I looked to my father and grandfather, who were watching me absently, but they didn't say anything, so I tried again. I did the same thing, but this time I stopped just short of where it had popped before, and held it steady for a moment, before bringing it into contact with the neutral box to see what would happen. But as soon as it came into contact with something solid, it burst like a bubble. Next, I tried with both hands, bringing them clumsily together, gathering chakra between them, and then pulling them slowly apart with an invisible bubble between them, before trying again. And it held stable for a couple of seconds, before falling apart as the neutral box broke the circuit I was making. I made the bubble smaller then, shrinking it slightly each time it failed. But by the time it was stable enough to remain in contact with the box, it was small enough to fit under my hands, and too small to sense anything within the container. But, since it wasn't falling apart, I started gathering more chakra within it while slowly deforming its shape, pushing the point of a cone slowly into the box. No. My father stopped me, finally speaking up, and I cut off the flow of my chakra. Once I did, he explained. If you gather that much chakra in one place, you might be able to penetrate the box. But if you're a medic, you tire yourself needlessly and hurt a patient that way. You were heading in the right direction before with the bubble. But the bubble is too fragile, I said. He agreed. And why is that? Because the chakra comes from me, I said. And it gets weaker and less stable the further away from my body it gets. That's why I tried using 2 hands instead, so the far side of the bubble wouldn't pop. But it still broke along the midpoint if I made it too large or it touched something else. But if I make it too small, I can't feel what's inside either. It's a complicated matter, my father agreed. The first box held onto chakra on its own, but the second box neither strongly absorbs nor strongly rejects chakra. So when you try to channel chakra through it, some will pass through and some will leak away. This process isn't random though. Some places on the box are more resistant and some are less, not only on the surface but beneath it. To see what's inside it, you need to find a path of least resistance leading from the exterior of the box to the interior, which is hard to do while a portion of whatever you put into it is being wasted. There are various ways to forcibly bore through a surface with chakra, of course, but the point of this exercise is to treat the box as if it were a patient, and to accomplish your goal without hurting them. The simplest way to do that is to surround the box completely with a bubble to keep any chakra from leaking away. But the larger the bubble is, the harder it is to achieve in a way that won't disturb a patient or disturb your control. How do you do it then? I asked, because I'd already figured that part out. That's harder to answer, he said. I was much older than you when I was trying to learn this, and I had enough chakra to simply force the matter and reinforce the bubble enough to keep it from popping. But I also failed to become a medic in the end, and I was docked points for that on the exam besides. On the other hand, for neutral materials like this, your aunt can simply touch them and send minute pulses of chakra through them to find the right path and see what's inside. But she also completed far more training than I did. It might not be impossible for you to use that small bubble to map out a path through this box, but that will take too long to be practical, and won't work once the boxes are layered. But during classes, I saw several people cover the box with a thin layer of chakra instead of a spherical bubble, though that also takes some skill. It's also possible to use a medium to help your chakra maintain its shape, although they don't allow that during the exam. One of the reasons medical ninja pick up water transformation is because flowing chakra through a liquid is convenient for things like this. At this stage though, I think it would be best for you to find a method that suits you, rather than worry about how everyone else does it. You'll have to polish your skills over time regardless, for there are quite a few boxes to go. A method that suits me, I thought, and one quickly came to mind. But would it work? Only one way to find out. The problem with making a bubble was, like I said, the chakra that composed that bubble was coming from me, and so the further it got from me, and thus from my chakra network, as well as the thinner I stretched it by inflating it, the harder it got to control and the weaker parts of it inevitably became. And because it was a bubble, or rather a sphere, if any point on that surface faltered, the whole thing would fall apart. As I was right now, I couldn't exact enough force with my chakra to make every point on such a large surface not only strong enough to bear the chakra I was using it to contain, but also the disruption of a solid object passing through that bubble's surface. Especially I was meant to be gentle about it too. Before my father had interrupted me, my next plan, if pushing through a small point hadn't worked, had been to layer the bubble. Grab my left wrist with my right hand and make a bubble there, with my left hand inside it. Then make a second bubble with that hand. But on top of needing twice the chakra, that would have just meant facing the same issues twice. so I doubted it would work. Failing that, I could have tried to surround myself, emit the same amount of chakra from every Tenketsu at the same time, while keeping it very close to my skin, and make a personal bubble, and then slowly slip things inside it while keeping the bubble strong. Which might have worked for a smaller object, but probably not something the size of his box. And I'd probably tire myself out pretty damn quickly doing that too. And even without my new father mentioning that he lost points brute forcing it, the whole point of his training was that I didn't have a lot of chakra to waste. Burning more energy just to make the bubble thicker wasn't the right answer, if it meant I'd still lose all that energy on a failed attempt. The methods my father describes made more sense to me. Rather than making the bubble around my hand, it was probably possible to make it around the box with the lessons from the tree climbing exercise. If I could make suction cups on the surface, it was probably possible to cover just the surface that way, then swell it into a bubble. With a medium, I could also see it being possible. I was having issues with the bubble popping when anything passed through it, but if the chakra was flowing through a liquid, it would just deform and flow around it. It was probably possible to learn how to do that on your own with enough practice. Both of these ideas would probably work if I took the time to practice, experiment, and get used to them. But what if I just cheated instead? Something I learned a long time ago was that it didn't do you any good, in a fight or in life, to bemoan all your flaws and weaknesses. If all you had were bugs, and you were fighting a guy who was surrounded by fire, or who desecrated anything that came near him, crying about it wasn't going to get you out of that situation. Instead, you had to figure out a way to leverage your strengths. And if my weakness was that I had a paltry amount of chakra, my strength was that I had all the processing power in the fucking world. Apparently, releasing chakra from every Tenketsu at once wasn't something just anyone in this world could do. But for me, it was easy, because it was just 361 different things to focus on at the same time. By that same logic, methods that might be impossible for anyone else, because they had too many moving parts, would be simple for me too, as long as the cost in chakra was minimized. How about this then? I thought, going back to basics and starting small. Gather chakra at a point, maintaining it, and keeping up the flow. Only this time, I started very small. Because as it happens, needing to use a limited supply of something as efficiently as possible wasn't exactly a new problem, in human history or in nature, and a lot of different solutions had been found as a result. There were only a few that I was particularly familiar with, admittedly, and they were for fairly specific problems. But the ones I was familiar with, I was very familiar with. For example, bees made their hives out of wax, and they made their wax by eating honey. But they had to collect nectar from over 100,000 flowers to make an ounce of honey, and then they had to consume about 8 ounces of honey to make an ounce of wax. As you might expect, given the amount of effort it took and the precious resources it consumed, it was important that the hive not waste any of that wax. And to that end, they made honeycombs. Originally cylindrical, through a combination of contact with other cells and temperature, they changed into a tessellating grid that maximized the volume of each cell, while minimizing the perimeter, and thus the amount of wax used by each. It was a shape I'd made use of before. For better or worse, I'd made it a part of who I was, so tightly intertwined with my identity and my ideas of power, that when I'd lost them, I'd lost so much more. It was one of the many things I didn't like to think about too much, but I'd made enough of them that I'd exhausted a supply that was meant to last centuries and minutes. I'd surrounded myself with them, and in the process, in order to hold on to a bit of who I was for just a little longer, and make them mine, I'd made all those portals hexagonal, and carefully fit them together into a curving mantle, a couple layers thick. But since Doormaker's portals had been stationary, every time I took a step, I'd closed and reopened all the portals in my mantle. Any time I'd moved someone else, I'd done the same. Turned my head and I'd make the wall of portals shutter closed, new ones opening out of sight. So you could say it was a familiar shape, I suppose. Though it didn't hurt that I had about 60,000 bees working on constructing honeycombs right now, out of the 500,000 or so that I currently controlled. Focusing on that, remembering that, instead of making a balloon of chakra, I made a tiny bead of it, drawing from countless memories of excreting wax from the glands on my abdomen. Mentally, I went through the familiar process of gathering it, or having another member of the hive gather it for me, masticating it to soften it, and then begin to shape it into part of a single cell. Other beads of chakra emerged from my hands, and I went through that process with each of them at the same time, keeping it clear in my mind. I didn't need to contain honey, so instead of wasting energy on making cells, I made one end almost flat. But to better match my memories and to make them tessellate, I made the other end half of a rhombic dodecahedron and brought 2 layers together with my hands. When I was done, each hexagon fit perfectly into place, with 6 more surrounding it without leaving any gaps, and the ends of 6 others underneath it. It didn't run into any issue with the box passing through it, because I simply built the grid around the box instead. A hemisphere, in seamless contact with the floor. It was at less risk of failure as well. With a bubble, a single breach meant the whole thing collapsed, which is why I'd been considering making 2. But even if I made a double-layered bubble, if any points on both bubbles faltered at the same time, no matter where those points were on either bubble, the whole thing would still fail. But, with many hexagonal cells, one cell failing was just one cell failing, because underneath and around that cell were other cells. It would only be an issue if 2 cells in the same spot broke, but even then, because it was multifaceted, the structure as a whole would remain even if the contents leaked out. I just have to fill the gaps. And for a while, that's what I did. To human eyes, I was just waving my hands in the air around the box, but in reality, whenever a cell failed, I moved my hand over it and carefully remade it, focusing for a bit on just doing that and getting used to holding it in place. Through my own sense for it, but also through the eyes of my Kakaichu, I carefully figured out which points were weaker, the best way to flow chakra through it, slowly getting used to the structure and making it mine again. Then, when I was confident, I focused on the box itself, guiding my chakra into and through it, and without any risk of the chakra leaking away and the whole thing collapsing, the rest was just a matter of finding a way from the outside to the inside, and it was easy. Or perhaps more like, this is what I do, I thought. Imagine for a moment that you are trying to map out and invade a secure facility without being able to see anything with your eyes. The halls are a labyrinth of dead ends and traps. How do you find the right way inside to steal some secure documents? Well, you just do it. Bugs fit into the ventilation and under the doors, or cling to people as they move throughout the facility. A bug on each person tells you their location. One on top of their heads, hands and feet give a pretty good idea of what they were doing, and more tiny bugs in the right places, such as around the edges of a keypad or on the joints of fingers, can tell you what passwords are being used. Have a bug on their head crawl down their back, and height, hair length and scent imply gender. One across the shoulder or chest indicate body shape. That plus clothing indicates identity. Do this for each person, keeping track of where and who each one is, and have more bugs mark each surface, track scents and chemicals, feel the flow of air, find openings, windows, doors, cracks and more. And soon you have what you need. Such a clear idea of what's going on that you can navigate it blind. Given time, you find the ways inside, where there's an opening or a specific code or a set of keys you track the location of. And the rest is simple. So, How did I map out the twisting, circuitous paths of least resistance from the outside of the box to the inside? By mapping them. It took some time, it took some effort, but that's all it took, and I found my way inside. I love you too, I said, reading the blocks inside only a bit awkwardly, and both my father and grandfather sat up. Tora, did you sense what was in the box? My father asked, sounding like he didn't believe it. You didn't use your bugs, Zor. I shook my head and then sent my bugs away. Understanding what I was getting at, he sent his away as well, and unlocked the box before changing the blocks inside. When he was done, I rebuilt my hemisphere of hexagons, and at that point I already knew how to get inside. Sunshine, I said, and my grandfather came over to watch as well. They changed the box again, and like they still couldn't believe it, they shook the box to change around the contents, and put it back down in front of me. The new word was weird, something like money paid for money, so I just pronounced it instead. Tsurisen? They checked again and looked at each other. Father, can you show us what you're doing on the first box, Bedbug? My grandfather asked, and when I nodded he swapped the boxes without bothering to put anything inside. With the box absorbing my chakra, it was a bit weirder to form my grid around it, but it was also easier to maintain the cells, so I managed. And soon it became visible around the box in bright golden light, clearer than when it had been a lumpy mass. Both of them looked concerned about that too, before my grandfather put a finger on it and pushed down. It didn't take him much effort at all to crack some of the cells, which didn't surprise me. Honeycombs could support 20 to 30 times its weight, but it also didn't weigh much. But, as expected, the rest of the cells remained. His frown deepened at the sight. Solid? More solid than I expected, at least, from someone who can't even make their chakra visible. I'd bet 100 Ryo that if we tested her, she'd be earth-natured. My father just shook his head. That doesn't... he began before stopping himself. More importantly, that shape transformation, father. Even if the output is low, it's clearly... Grandfather raised a hand to stop him and shot him a look. Making a bubble of chakra is also shape transformation, he said pointedly, which seemed like an evasion. I was pretty sure what he meant was, let's talk about that later, instead. And shaping your chakra is the correct answer, is it not? My father bit his tongue for a moment before nodding unhappily. Then he knelt by my side and touched my wrist. I felt his bugs react as he checked my chakra, and I let him. It takes most people a long time to learn even the basics of shape transformation, he said, like he was trying to say it as a good thing, and couldn't quite manage. He paused and then seemed to change tracks. But sometimes forms of it come to people naturally, flourishes and embellishments unconsciously leaking into people's jutsu, making them unique. When that happens, leaning into it can make a person's technique stronger as well, so it'd be good to practice something like this every day, I suppose, as long as you don't strain yourself. I told you it's best to find a method that works for you, so if this does, that's good then. He seemed to be trying to convince himself more than me. But perception of and with your chakra can be considered the basis of shape transformation, so training one tends to help with the other. It's a useful skill. Your father mentioned that your aunt could send pulses of it through something, like a kind of sonar. That's a form of shape manipulation too, and it can be used to examine more than just the contents of a box. Ambu infiltration training practically requires it, and their surveillance training needed something similar. But the more chakra gathered, the easier it is to notice too. It takes a lot of skill to shape your chakra without it being obvious. It was a warning, if one that just seemed to make my father's mood worse. Still, I nodded. I'll be careful, I promised. Both the men still seemed worried, stroking their beards unconsciously as they looked at me. I decided to change the subject. But how precise can chakra senses get? To my knowledge, there's no precise limit, my father said. While medic nin generally start with larger injuries, I know that the more advanced ones can directly tend to the pathogens in the body, though I don't know if anyone in the village can still do that, now that Tsunade Hime is gone. But it's said that the first and second could tell someone's bloodline just by looking at them, and certain ninjutsu could be used to change the atomic structure of objects, although that's more common in Iwa than in Konoha. I don't know anything but the most general theory behind it, but from what Minato said, his space-time ninjutsu required even more precise senses. Space-time ninjutsu? Sometimes it felt like these ninja could do anything. But mentioning that seemed to calm my father down a bit too. Or, perhaps more likely, the mention of this Minato, the fourth Hokage who had been elected at last, sort of. From what I'd heard from people on the street and in the compound, the only two names that had really been in contention for the role were Namikaze Minato and Orochimaru of the Sannin, and the former had won. I didn't know much about the man beyond rumors, but just thinking about him seemed to ease my father's concerns. Possibly because, at least according to word of mouth, the man was so strong he'd single-handedly changed the tide of the war, and was famous for personally wiping out several armies. My father might have just been less worried about the possibility of me getting drafted for a war when other countries had flee-on-sight orders for the current Hokage. Though as fellow Jonin, they had apparently gone on a few missions together, and he seemed to think highly of him in general. Overall opinion of our glorious new leader seemed to follow along similar lines, at least within the Aburame clan, that he was a man noble enough to uphold the village's values, and also so strong that nobody would test him. The alternative choice, this Orochimaru, had apparently been cause for more concern, simply because he belonged to the older generation and had a more pragmatic approach, having been favored for the role by some of the village's warhawks, and thought to be a shoo-in as the third's personal disciple. Given my family's concerns, the results were cause for quiet celebration. I didn't have much thought on the man, either of the men, really, beyond that. Right now he was seemingly still in the transition phase, and so he hadn't done much yet. Word on the street was the third was trying to make the change in power as gentle as possible, because his own promotion had been anything but. It was almost funny to think that this was, apparently, the first actual transitionary period in the village's history. The first had been elected, but the second just took the mantle of Hokage after he was killed. Then the third was field promoted in turn. The very idea of a Hokage sticking around to aid and train their successor was seemingly still a novel enough concept that there were no formal rules for it, and so no one was entirely sure how long it was going to last, or even what it meant for the village. For example, the third apparently had a council that was really just his old teammates and war buddies from back in the day, that he consulted on important decisions because he trusted their advice. But it wasn't entirely clear if the fourth was going to keep those, or make his own. Or if all the major positions in the village were due to change. Did the Jonin commander and the head of interrogation come with and change with the hat, or were they separate? The matter was apparently unclear enough that things in the village were getting a bit exciting, and I'd poke fun at it, but I knew enough about American history to say that elections had gotten pretty interesting around this point as well, like with the idea of a vice president. Some things needed hammering out, I suppose. Not that it mattered much to me either way while I was still a baby, so long as I didn't get abducted. This shape transformation, though, if familiar shapes worked best, I had a few ideas. Maybe it was because I was thinking about ninjas a lot lately, but my thoughts were turning to some of the other stuff that had come over to the States before Leviathan sinking Kyushu gave Japan bigger things to worry about than exporting media. Sentai had been a popular genre for a little while, before it died an abrupt and terrible death when a member of Japan's Sentai elite became one of the most prolific killers on Earth. But if familiar shapes were ideal, surely my costume counted. The thought was funny, at least. I'd watched the show as a kid about teenagers with attitudes transforming into costumes, which was a bit nostalgic. Probably best to save thoughts like that for when I had enough chakra to experiment with, though. But what should we name it then? My grandfather asked as he got the resistant box ready. This is our bedbug's first creation, so we should honor the occasion. How about we call it Hashijutsu? Spare her your puns, father, my father replied. It'll be embarrassing for her later, like it was for me. Then, probably for my sake, he explained. It's a joke, because Hashimi Jutsu means honey, he said. A Hashijutsu would be, I suppose, a bee jutsu, but the words also sound similar. I know, I thought, more interested in the new box than the jokes. Failing to get a reaction, however, only seemed to encourage my grandfather. Such was always the way with people who liked puns. Rather than a bedbug, perhaps we should call her our little queen bee, he said, pronouncing it Jobachi. Ah, but then doesn't that make her a Imebachi? Please don't call her that either, father said patiently. I'd prefer it if she wasn't nicknamed after a parasitoid wasp. Parasitoids? Did they mean the Ichneumon wasp? How did that thing get named Princess Bee? I was more baffled by that than I was concerned with the name, but I was thusly exposed to a variety of bee puns. Yoho was apparently the word for beekeeping, and a beekeeper was a yohaka. But yoho was also the word for directions on how to use something, as well as a casual greeting. Hoki came from the word for bees and rising up, with a literal definition of bees rising up in swarms, but it was also the word for rebellion. So yada yada, funny wordplay. I wasn't entirely sure why this needed a name, but I didn't speak against it either. I'd had times when I'd thought about naming my attacks, but I'd always gotten cold feet in the end and been too embarrassed to say them out loud. What if I said them in front of a crowd and everyone thought they were stupid and that I was lame? I wasn't sure I'd be able to cope. So I left them to it, ready to blame them for it if it ever publicly humiliated me, and in the end came down to my grandfather's hoka, meaning honeycomb and various puns, and my father's hachimitsuro, honey gold. I liked the sound of the latter more, but I also hated the color, especially since it seemed to be getting progressively harder to get away from it, especially with it being the color of my chakra. I didn't want to disappoint either of them though, so in the end my first jutsu was named Hoka Hachimitsuro, which my grandfather pronounced in a deep, solemn voice every time he said it, lowering his voice mid-conversation and sounding like he was pronouncing someone's death. I filed the name away regardless. Butterflies, I said, reading off the blocks in the box as my grandfather continued chuckling at his own jokes. The resistant box was the same as the neutral box, really. It was just that the specific gaps and openings were a lot smaller and rarer. If the conductive box was a completely open facility, and the neutral box was equal parts open space and walls in a way that resulted in something like a labyrinth, the resistant box was about 95% wall and 5% pathway. After I found a way through the neutral box, the next two attempts revealed more and more openings, of what must have theoretically been dozens. In contrast, the resistant box only seemed to have 1 or 2 ways in, but that's all it was. It was a more secure facility to break into, but the methods of breaking in didn't actually change. It wasn't even hostile, it was just closed off. I'd had to navigate places that actively killed my swarms, and by comparison this was just a bit time consuming with a clumsier swarm. My father dropped a wooden toy block he'd been fiddling with and stared at me, looking stunned. He opened his mouth once, closed it, and just didn't seem to know what to do. Let's stop here for today, grandfather said, expressing sudden calm, and turned abruptly on his heel and just picked me up, taking me away from my box. I silently put up with it. He turned towards my still staring father. Is Himari still visiting Aoi? That's... Father began before falling silent for a long while. He closed his eyes and then nodded. Yes. Is everything alright? He asked, and there was something pointed to the question. It's been a while. Again, they looked at each other, carefully talking around what they meant. My father slowly nodded again. She has been gone all day, hasn't she? Father asked, even though it was only 1:27, according to the bugs I kept on a clock inside. But my mother had left pretty early in the morning, I suppose, seemingly in a bit of a rush. Perhaps I should go check on her. But will you be... Do you think I need help protecting the clan? Grandfather asked, even though he's been following the unspoken rule of two of them always being near me for the past month. My father didn't move right away though, just watching, looking like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I'll be right back, he whispered instead. Just gonna make sure she's alright. Take your time, Grandfather replied, and he was gone. After a long moment, my grandfather sighed. He walked over to the chair on the side of the training room and sat down, still holding me in his arms. He sighed. Well? I looked up at him and tilted my head, waiting. It's hard for me to imagine someone completing 3 of those boxes in one day without any prior training, but maybe I could believe it. That's why geniuses are called geniuses after all, he said, using that word again. Tensai, heaven gift. Maybe you just have the control needed for that, or precise enough senses. Advanced shape transformations usually take months or years to familiarize yourself with and execute. But stranger things have happened. And yet, I can't help but notice that the one you struggled the most with was the middle box. He let that statement linger in the air for a moment before continuing. I don't suppose you've been practicing on your own, even though we asked you not to, he asked gently. I won't get upset even if you say yes. Your father isn't upset either. It's just that some of this is hard for us to understand. It's something that makes you wonder, even feel lost. There was a time when I was training your father and everything felt fine, normal, natural. And then he had his first real battle, and I came home to my son shaking after his first... Well, suddenly, I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore, or what I'd ever been doing. It's different for him, I'm sure, but you have to understand. I don't think even he quite expected it to hit him quite this hard, but this was something he worked for years at and failed to do. And there was a moment where I think we both thought you might be able to do it in a day. He's proud of you too, but you have to forgive him if, for a moment, he felt crushed and had a moment where he thought, all my efforts only amounted to this? He sounded like he wanted me to say yes, and it wasn't entirely untrue, so I nodded. But when I did, he looked at me and arched a brow, like he hadn't expected an admission and so suddenly didn't believe it. I wasn't sure what he... Well, I already had a lifetime of evidence that I wasn't particularly good at being a daughter, or a friend, or a girlfriend, or a teacher, or a hero, or seemingly anything else I really wanted to be. But I hoped, after my death, someone had the decency to look back and go, well, at least she really, really tried, despite herself. If only because I saved the world. I hadn't wanted to hurt my father. I just hadn't been able to be who he wanted me to be, do what he wanted me to do, and remain myself. I'd hoped, at least, that in the process of hurting them, I'd be able to save him and Broxton Bay. But I guess it hadn't worked out that way. I suppose I wasn't good at that too. And I knew I was causing trouble for this family, for my new family, who had probably just wanted a cute child and had instead gotten stuck with me. Maybe I really was a hemibachi, a brood parasite infesting this nest. But I didn't want to be. I didn't want to hurt my mother by being a strange child. and my father by being a genius. The problem was, even after dying and coming back to life, I was still me. Maybe I should have tried to keep lying, but not having to lie had been such a relief that, well, here we are. I tried again anyway. Been practicing with my bugs, I said, for months now. Practicing this? He asked skeptically, looking at the boxes we'd left on the ground. I shook my head. But stuff like this, mapping places I can't see, I said, hoping that his own familiarity would fill in the gaps on something that was hard to explain. The methods I used to make sense of the world with my swarm could fill a series of books, but he'd mentioned the clan could do something similar, and I hoped it was enough to make sense of this. Channeling chakra through things, other stuff. He seemed to consider that for a long moment before nodding slowly, so it probably tracked at least a little bit. And your issues with the middle box? Felt different, I admitted. The way when chakra acted when my swarm did this was different from how it worked for me. Ah, he said, as if pieces were slowly coming together. I suppose it wouldn't. It's a matter of size, you see. People often make the mistake of thinking that bugs are strong despite being small, when actually they're strong because they're small. And the way things behave at that scale can be rather different besides. Making chakra close to solid is probably easy when a drop of water is already firm enough to sit on because of its surface tension. It can hold its shape even if penetrated. He paused. But I guess you don't need to be told that anymore, he said, and I nodded again. In my first life, one of the reasons my trigger event had been so jarring, let's say, was that it didn't come with any kind of built-in sense of scale, or anything to make it clear that the multi-jawed, many-limbed monstrosities I was sensing millions of were bugs I could see anywhere, and I hadn't figured that out until I was at the hospital. I felt everything through my swarm from their scale, which had taken some getting used to. Here, now, with chakra, it would apparently take some getting used to again. I was and would continue to practice through my swarm, but it was something important to keep in mind. Size matters in both directions. And the bees? I looked at him and waited again, because I wasn't entirely sure what he meant. He clicked his tongue and shook his head. You never quite react how I expect you to, he complained. You're doing something with the bees, I suppose. Ah, that. I was, of course, doing something with the bees. I had lots and lots of bees around, after all. But by that standard, I was also doing something with close to 400 million other bugs of varying degrees of usefulness, so it hadn't really stood out to me. But I guess the hexagons had given him that idea, which wasn't entirely right, but wasn't entirely wrong either. I nodded. I suspected, because I'd seen something like this technique before, he said. There was a bee-controlling clan in Iwa that regularly used a form of shape manipulation similar to this, although most of the time they used earth, something they picked up from their hives, I figured. What your father said wasn't wrong. It is normal for certain tells to slip into people's chakra, even on accident. Again, not quite right, but not entirely wrong either. And saying that a lot of it also came from that time I fought a multi-dimensional war against an alien god in my past life seemed like a bad idea. So again I just nodded. Can you show me then? He asked, when what he was really asking was for me to trust him. I nodded and called up a small swarm to lead the way. My grandfather carried me out of the training room and I guided him to an out-of-the-way bit of woodland within the compound. I had eyes on and inside every member of the Aberame clan, which made it pretty easy to figure out where they normally went and avoid those places to keep out of sight, made easier when what I was working with was easy enough to dismiss to begin with. Even as a member of the Aberame clan, I wasn't sure what my grandfather saw when he looked at my experiments in what was seemingly just a normal woodland area, if with a higher than normal number of insect nests. How best to explain this? I've been breeding the Kikaichu carefully, I began slowly, which was a bit of an understatement. I considered my Kikaichu just as valuable as my relay bugs had been, and so the moment I realized what they could do, I started growing my swarm. Most of the Aburame clan were limited to just what bugs their bodies could host, though a few possessed colonies that grew beyond that, which they generally kept in an insect jar. But I was only limited by my range and the amount of chakra I could supply. And even then, I could control a starving swarm if needed, or supplement that chakra with portions stolen from others. Good, grandfather said, before pausing as if wondering if it really was good that a baby was doing that. After a moment though, he continued, if with less certainty. It's best to start that young. Aside from your aunt, you've met Azai, haven't you? He's one of our experts on this. That was also a bit of an understatement. As a clan focused on the use of bugs, it should also go without saying that the Aburame had some entomologists on staff. In fact, there were about 20 members of the Aburame clan who did nothing but that, constantly working to breed better, stronger bugs, with a history going back about 300 years, and I watched their work with interest, learning everything I could from what they did and said. They routinely gauged the health of clan members' swarms by collecting and testing random specimens in their hives, gave exercise and diet recommendations, and performed checkups every few weeks as a matter of course, and all of them were experts on the Kikaichu. But even with that level of skill, there was a difference in time and attention. They could run routine checkups, but I collected a constant stream of diagnostic information from every single member of every single hive, every second of every day, and could make individual bugs react to that information however I wanted. I could make my bugs start to breed regardless of the season too, and quickly grow their population, which is how I'd gotten enough Black Widow spiders to make my costume with in just a couple months, and I could do the same with the Kikaichu. But it should also come as no surprise that I could breed my insects selectively to try and draw out certain traits, which I'd also taken advantage of in my previous life, producing spiders that could make a bit more web or had more potent venom. Except, in the end, there was a limit to how useful that could get, especially with my short career. I could make bigger bugs, stronger bugs, bugs that were more poisonous or had better webs. But at the end of the day, they were still bugs, and the benefits were relatively minor each generation. By the end of my career, I had Black Widows that were 2 to 3 times larger than average, and to possess stronger venom and webs. But they would still die just the same to a pyrokinetics flames. The type of people I fought fell roughly into the category of likely to be instantly defeated if a swarm of millions of bugs fell upon them, regardless of relative quality and size, and almost to completely immune to bugs, with a grey area in between built entirely on quick thinking and creativity. I'd beaten Alexandria by filling her lungs, and Sere by tying him up with my webs, for example. But 2 or 10 or even 100 generations of careful breeding my bugs wouldn't have let me hurt someone who could stand inside a miniature sun, or who desecrated my bugs if they got too close. The Kikaichu, though, had introduced an entirely new dimension to that. Chakra. And to that end, I wondered how he'd react to this. Not just my Kikaichu, I said. All of them. Immediately he frowned, looking concerned. But I'd prepared for that. However my hero career might have gone, I'd done my best to learn from Glean too, and when I'd seen a chance to score some points, I'd taken them. When the bugs inside the lady in the blue house? Michiru, grandfather offered. When they started getting sick, I removed the ones that were infected, in her and all the other clansmen, I said. Michiru had gone to the doctor as soon as she noticed something wrong, but by the time they finished diagnosing it, I had already cleared the compound of any carriers. The ones the doctor had taken in for testing were the last ones left, so I could actually prove I did something if I had to. Grandfather drummed his fingers, still frowning. "I heard she recovered fast," he murmured. "That's good. And?" "Just trying to help," I said, because really it had been a whole process, but I tried my best to explain. I'd been trying to make the clan's bugs stronger for months now, first by breeding for chakra sensitivity, entirely for my own benefit. It had started with an experiment. I spread my swarm throughout my range and had them go as far out as they could while gathering chakra, and see when I faded from the senses of each, and then I slowly repeated that experiment with bugs throughout the clan. I then had those with the best chakra sensitivity breed much more frequently, and then bred the best of the results to the best. Then, once the new generation was grown, I repeated the process, over and over again, mentally marking each of their results. I did the same for separate strands of bugs bred for chakra capacity, and interbred the two frequently to see what happened. The same went for lines that consumed chakra particularly fast and such, along with longevity, health, speed, strength, disease resistance, etc. Then, when my efforts seemed to show success, I spread them around. I knew enough about breeding and had overheard enough about the bugs to know it was good to diversify. To that end, I'd even maintained distinct family lines within each of the Aburame, breeding those bug dynasties for preferable traits, and then having arranged marriages between the different bug kingdoms at night, having specific bugs crawl free of the clansmen at night for political trysts before returning, all of which might have been a sign of my steadily dwindling sanity, but was also very useful. And since the clan swarm was my swarm, I did my best to give back to them, and ensure that the swarm remained strong. The Kikaichu were my prized bugs after all, the foundation of the rest of my swarm. I did notice my Kikaichu were livelier of late, I suppose, Grandfather said, still sounding wary. But it happened slowly enough I didn't think much of it. I nodded, only a touch sadly. On average, my eugenics experiments had been working, but while selective breeding was faster than evolution, it still took time, and they were still bugs. For example, one of my biggest goals was to breed them to have more chakra, which was working. Having started with one bug of chakra, a made-up unit I used to indicate the average chakra across my entire swarm, paltry as it was compared to the amount in a human, in just 5 generations of careful inter- and cross-dynasty breeding, I'd successfully increased it to 1.8 bugs worth of chakra, which was an incredible leap for bug kind in my opinion, for all that most people probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference at a glance. That's okay, then, Grandfather said, like he was trying to convince himself. If it's benefiting the clan, then that's good. Just keep me informed of whatever you're doing, please. I nodded, which led to this next bit. I've been doing the same with other bugs too, I said, to which my grandfather looked incredibly unsurprised, though his features remained concerned. Dangerous, he said, sounding like this was something he'd been preparing to say for a while. Finding and creating new species of Kaichu is something that's invaluable for the clan, a dream of many members of our family, but also something that needs to be handled very carefully, because all of the Kaichu are deadly in their own ways, and so it's not just a matter of how strong they are, but how well they can be controlled. If a new species can kill a man in a single bite, but doesn't respond well to our form of symbiosis, that could be bad. For all of us. I'm not breeding them for anything dangerous, I said, and kept the yet at the end to myself. I could have said that I was confident controlling them wouldn't be an issue for me, but that would probably have come across as arrogant rather than reassuring, especially because, being a baby still, I had to consider that issue as well. I didn't have a lot of autonomy after all, couldn't always decide where or when I went places. I couldn't take the risk that if, say, I got a fever or something and my parents rushed me to the doctor while I was still out of it, that my death swarm would break containment and start eating people. And there were plenty of less hyperbolic possibilities that could still be pretty bad. When I could walk around on my own, I'd make cages for the more dangerous bugs, like I used to have for my black widows. But until then, I knew to play things safe. "What have you been working on then?" he asked, sounding doubtful. "Honeybees, ants, aphids, termites, spiders like the Yoro, and paper wasps," I said, and then tried to rephrase it. "Bugs that make stuff." Grandfather looked surprised for a long moment, but then he perked up. Oh, that's good," he said, smiling, looking around as if he could see something else. "That's great. Why, back in the day, well, the Senju, they loved their honey wine. They'd break it out when they had any excuse. So after the village formed, your grandmother and I talked about using our skills to make some locally." His smile faded slightly. "Of course, then the first died, and the second, and the Senju, well, they spread out right as the wars began, and the idea of using our skills for such things fell to the wayside," he said before hugging me slightly. "But if that's what you want to do, that's great. I guess when you start with the expectation that your baby granddaughter is playing with a rocket launcher, just about anything is good news. But I had an admission. I wanted to see if I could mold chakra into the things they make," I said. "Because it was familiar and came naturally to them, I wanted to see what would happen." And it was true, however much it might also have been an understatement. Every day I had about 130 million redwood ants working on their growing mounds, combining grass, wood and dirt with resin from trees that they mixed with their venom and saliva. Those same ants farmed countless aphids as they fed on plants and were milked for honeydew. Wasps chewed up wood, combining it with their saliva to make something like paper, which they used to make their hives, while termites chewed up wood, soil and fecal matter and shaped it with their drool. Spiders weaved their webs, and bees made their hives out of wax. All the while I worked to slowly, carefully mold chakra to aid them, using it as a testbed for my own efforts. I wasn't necessarily thrilled by how many of said training methods currently involved saliva, but all told, I thought I was making steady progress, practicing countless slightly different ways to shape chakra and mold it into physical form. And today, my grandfather had introduced me to the concept of yin and yang chakra, and whatever being earth-natured entailed, with which I hoped to go even further. And among those bugs, my grandfather might have been right about the bees being special in a way. Every day, close to 300,000 of them ventured miles to gather nectar from flowers, making them one of the few bugs I had leave my range and come back. I practiced the technique my grandfather had mentioned before with them, trying to get used to sharing chakra and experiences with them, if only to figure out what was happening outside my sight, and I ran tests with them. Having bees I molded the chakra for leave my range and act freely, shaping the chakra for others while they were shaping wax into honeycombs, and guiding the many, many bees that went through the process of making honey. With them, with all my bugs, I carefully focused on every step of every single process, and how every bit of chakra I used seemed to shape that. Even before today's training, I've been trying to do this, but the box training gave me a new reference point and a way to test the results myself, and better determine how chakra flowed through different materials and different creatures. And between the bees with their honey, and the ants farming amphids, and so much more, I had a few 100 million points of reference each day, especially when it came to sharing chakra. Tropophylaxis was the process through which many insects exchanged food, with one member carrying food in their stomach and passing it on to others in the hive as a kind of social stomach. And I'd gotten used to exchanging chakra, especially my chakra, between them the same way. From amphids feeding on plants to the ants sucking up their honeydew to then pass that milk between other members in the nest, to bees collecting nectar, breaking it down in their stomach and passing it on to other bees to chew on it and swirl it in their mouths, slowly removing moisture and thickening it. Really, in a roundabout way, with the amount of oral chakra exercises I've been doing, I might have already managed to work around my lack of manual dexterity. As soon as I finished teething, I'd surely be unstoppable. I'd say I had some success on that front. Except I wasn't entirely sure what I was trying to do yet, what I wanted from this, or even what I was expecting. To learn how to make these materials out of chakra? To mix them with chakra in a lasting way for some result? Or maybe to just get a feel for using chakra through them? Those were coming along, I suppose, but if it was possible, I suppose I wanted to shape chakra in a very specific way. To store it for later use, like the bees did their honey, to get around how little chakra I had. But so far I hadn't managed that yet. Maybe just because my beehives were still young and had to focus just on surviving their first winter. I kept at it anyway, over and over again. And I had hopes for next year, once the seeds I had my ants spreading bloomed and the hives had larger stores to work with. But I just have to wait and see, I suppose. At least my spiders are doing fine, I thought, trying to look on the bright side. And if nothing else, I was sure all the experience in transferring chakra would come in handy. I'd gotten to the point where I could keep the entire swarm connected twofold, with my power and my chakra, which had to be useful for something. Taking and redistributing energy had been the entire gimmick of some pretty dangerous trumps in my past life. I realized my grandfather was still watching me, eyes considering. And trying to learn yin transformation, I assume? He asked, and to that I shook my head. Didn't know about it until today, I said, and this time I was completely honest. I should tell you then, I suppose. If giving form to the formless is the nature of yin chakra, then breathing life into things that have none is the nature of yang chakra, he said. If you've been trying to mold chakra into things you've been making, and here he quirked an eyebrow at me, and if you've succeeded in doing that to any degree, then it means you're using yang chakra, he said. Ah, I said, feeling awkward. It's a good thing, he said, laughing slightly at my reaction. And like we said before, the Aburami naturally lean towards yang chakra. It wouldn't be surprising if it came somewhat easier to you. Though it's still shocking a child can use yang chakra at all, much less multiple kinds. It was phrased like a question, but I didn't answer because I wasn't sure. Despite my father's warnings, I didn't seem to have any particular issue differentiating between how the different forms of chakra felt. Or was I? I had, admittedly, expected to crack whatever I was trying to do in short order, under the weight of 100 million tiny bodies. But when I hadn't, I just assumed it was a harder problem than I expected. It didn't feel like I was having any issues keeping the types of chakra straight. But maybe that was the problem, because I also didn't feel like I was doing anything special. What's more, despite my grandfather's reassurance, if they were yang techniques, I couldn't use these jutsu myself, not really. Or, at least, it was disproportionately more costly for me to do so. Which was fine as long as I left it to my swarm, but I had resources I was still leaving untapped, damn it! And, truthfully, it was, well, a little embarrassing that the day I'd promised myself I'd learn yin chakra, I'd also learned my efforts were going so poorly, I'd unconsciously discovered the opposite. "How's your pyrokinetic training going, sweetie?" "Well, on my first day, I froze the lake." "I'll keep my word, of course," Grandfather said, distracting me from my thoughts. "We'll make a place for your spiders. And while we're at it, we'll make a place for these bees too. We'll just say that's for me and for old time's sake. Since your father's gone, we should probably talk about this now. I assume you plan to continue these experiments with your spider silk." I nodded. "If you make a new technique, you'll have to call it Kenshi, of course," he said like it was obvious. When I just looked at him, he explained. "It means silk thread, you see." "And swordsman," I said, seeing through the pun, and he beamed at me. "So you knew," he said. "Words are funny things, changing their meaning with how they're written. You know, back in the day, I used to carry a sword with me wherever I went." "I didn't know you were a swordsman," I asked, because he fell silent and seemed to want me to. "Never practiced a day in my life," he boasted. "But whenever trouble seemed to be brewing and I was cornered, I'd drop the sword, look them in the eyes and say, 'Wait, I'm unarmed.'" I had to smile at that, because I understood as well as he did, we were never unarmed. "So you can smile," he said. "When you're older, I'll teach you my secret technique, Shizen Gekka." He raised his voice and sounded serious, quickly moving to put his hand on the hilt of a phantom sword. The name, Mountain of Corpses, Seas of Blood. A poetic way of describing a scene of carnage. "Does your secret technique involve calling a swarm of bugs, Grandfather?" I asked. "Of course," he said easily. "And then there's Isen Shishibuki. One flash, then blood spray. Another insect calling technique, I assumed. I laughed slightly, and so did he. After that, things were calm. I expected something to happen when my father returned, looking harried, confused, happy, and worried all at once. But nothing did. He didn't mention what happened that day again, or seemed bothered in the slightest when we trained the next day, and I decided to take things a bit slow, at least in the training room, relying more on my swarm of millions. My family built an earthen house for my swarms and began to construct some beehives, and things calmed down. My father started reading books to me at night, as if apologizing for something, and I went along with it to do the same, and things were fine. I trained, I worked on my projects, and things seemed to steadily get better. I was, truth be told, hard as it was to believe, happy. I was happy with the way things were. It may have been a child's happiness, born from not knowing or having to worry about the outside world, but here, now, I felt content. I felt like things were okay. I was doing enough, growing fast enough, that it was fine to take things easy. Perhaps it was inevitable, then, that during my 10th month in this world, the village would get attacked by a giant fox.